Welcome everyone to these new seminars in global history and international law. It's a pleasure to welcome today Doreen Lustig, Giovanni Mantilla, and Boyne van Dijk on the sessions on the histories of the laws on war, of the laws of war. So yeah, thank you so much for the speakers today for accepting to participate in this session, which looks very promising because of the work and the expertise of the three experts. And thanks everyone also who is joining us today. So at first we will start with a presentation of the different speakers, and then we will directly go beyond to the conversation. So let me start with Doreen Lustig. So Doreen Lustig is an associate professor at Tel Aviv University at the Faculty of Law. She graduated at Tel Aviv University in sociology and anthropology, and also at NUI Law School. She is the author of the recently published monograph Veiled Power, International Law and the Private Corporation from 1886 to 1981. And it has been published last year at Oxford University Press.
Now it is my turn to introduce Giovanni Mantilla, who is a university lecturer at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University, where he is also a fellow at the Latterback Center. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota in political science, and he holds a degree in political science and languages and sociocultural studies from the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, which also happens to be my alma mater. He recently published the book Lawmaking Under Pressure, International Humanitarian Law and Internal Armed Conflict, which was also recently awarded the Francis Lieber Prize by the American Society of International Law.
And finally, our last speaker is Boyne van Dijk. So Boyne van Dijk is a Mackenzie Fellow at the University of Melbourne. So he taught previously at the London School of Economics, King's College London, Queen's Mary, and also the University of Amsterdam. So he studied political science and history in Amsterdam, Istanbul, Florence, and at Columbia University. And he completed his PhD at EY. So he's currently, I think it's going to be soon published, his book at Oxford University Press also, which uses a comparative lens to understand the making of 1949 Geneva Conventions. And he's also working on a new promising book manuscript.
Thank you. So before we start, I would just like to talk a little bit about what we envision in terms of the logistics of today's conversation, seeing that sadly, Giovanni will have to leave us a little bit early as he has to teach today. And again, I reiterate our thanks for you to participate in the midst of your very extensive teaching commitments. What we'll do is that we'll first have a conversation of a couple of minutes, then we'll open the ground to Q&A just in case people in the audience have questions for Giovanni, and then we'll continue again with some questions that me and Sophie have prepared for Doreen and for Boyd. So perhaps just to break the ice, I would just like to start asking all of our three panelists, if you could share with us a little bit more, how did you come to approach the laws of war as a scholarly pursuit? In terms of background, in terms of your interest, in terms of your experiences, I think it's always helpful to know what is the background behind your research projects. Who would like to begin?
I can start if you'd like. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you, Daniel and Sophie, for the invitation, and hello to everyone watching. And I apologize in advance for having to leave in just about 45 minutes. So how I came to IHL, the laws of war, as a topic, it was not a topic that I began studying until I started my PhD program. I came into the PhD program from studying human rights and human rights responsibilities, the debate about human rights responsibilities for non-state actors, in particular with corporations in mind, and that's the subject of Doreen's new book. So, but eventually, soon after arriving in my program, I realized that I wanted to think more broadly about international law as a regime that was created by states to regulate states, but that also attempted to regulate violent actors in world politics. That struck me as a puzzle. And so then I came upon IHL as a primary regime of international law that does that. My biography also intervened in that, being Colombian and having grown the country, watching a country undergoing internal conflict and watching news about war atrocity on a daily basis. So that was also a motivation. So there was both a sort of a biographical and a more theoretical reason why I came to it.
Doreen, Boyd, who would like to go next?
I can try. So Histories of the Laws of War is not something that I've been doing from the outset as my main scholarly I guess interest. As Anne-Sophie mentioned earlier, I worked on the history of corporations in international law for quite a while, but I did. I wanted to expand my horizons and my understanding of the ways in which international law is made and the international law making processes. And I also wanted to try and think anew through the historical engagement on what is international law and how international law is made. And I think that these kind of broader questions brought me to the codification of international humanitarian law in its earlier phases, because this was perhaps the most prominent or one of the most prominent early codification projects of the modern international law as we knew it. So I was seeking, I guess, to understand more profoundly how international law came about, not necessarily through the perspectives or lens of international lawyers and professionals, but also kind of going back to more conservative international law historical methodologies that look at diplomatic history, and at the same time looking at histories of civil society, grassroots, and kind of transnational processes. So I think for me, the object and purpose at the outset was more instrumental to the broader jurisprudential questions, but then I kind of fell in love in the subject matter. And so I think in some ways I'm probably going to stay for a while and engage more deeply in questions of law and peace and the laws of war that are more, and so I kind of moved from the procedural aspects that were more of interest to me and the questions of agency to the substantive questions that then kind of blew me away and made me want to learn and study more.
Thank you, Doreen. That's great. And I know that Sophie has a very precise question on codification. But before we go to that, Boyd, would you like to continue?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on this wonderful workshop series. It's a really great privilege, and to see Doreen and Giovanni again. So for me, international law has never really been that much of an interest until very recently. So I think that's kind of at least for one person in the room as well. For me, even though I'm rooted in the world city of justice and peace, The Hague's reputation never really resonated with me. So for me, the interest in international law, specifically laws of war, only happened when I became a graduate student at Columbia University. So in the wake of 9/11, I heard of course a lot of debate in the United States about the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, and while taking classes with historians and political scientists at different departments at Columbia, I became increasingly interested in kind of the connection between violence and law. That was really kind of the thing I was interested in. So my previous book, which was published in Dutch, was about the history of mass violence in Nazi-occupied Europe. So I'd always been kind of always having this interest in violence, and not only because of the discussions in the United States about the laws of war and the connection with violence, I started to further explore it. And then some of my professors were saying, well, if you want to do a PhD and if you're interested in the laws of war, you should consider writing about the 49 Geneva Conventions, because we don't really have a standard work yet on this subject. So that's how I started to move into the field of laws of war and eventually finishing my PhD and still working on it today. That's kind of the short life story, or my recent love affair, as some say, with the laws of war.
Great, thank you for your answers. So now we will speak a bit about the codification of the laws of war, as Daniel has mentioned. And so Giovanni, Doreen, and Boyd, all of the three, you are bringing a new perspective on the codification of the laws of war by making the assumption that the states want to protect themselves from the danger of civilian population, and more precisely, the democratization of warfare. But how do you consider the role of nationalism and internal conflict play in the codifications of the laws of war in the 19th and 20th century? And maybe also, since it is also very related to the question about nationalism and also internal conflict, after we can also already speak the second questions. So how did the developments also of human rights impact the codification of the laws of war? So, yeah, Giovanni, please, since you are going to leave us earlier, so please answer.
I'll take the lead. Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
So what role did nationalism and internal conflict play in the codification of the law of war in the 19th century and 20th century? Obviously a huge question.
Yes.
Right, so I would say that for the 19th century, in terms of the question about whether nationalism and internal conflict played a facilitating role or a hindering role in the development of greater international legal restraints, I would say that they played a role as undoubtedly negative factors. They hindered the development of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, towards the protection of the victims of war in internal conflict, right? And I would put not just nationalism and sort of revolutions, domestic revolutions, in that box of hindering factors, but also obviously imperialism, right, after the scramble for Africa, after the Berlin Conference in particular. So these three factors made the attitudes of states in Europe in particular a lot more stringent, a lot more pro-regime and sovereigntist, what Doreen and Eyal Benveniste called reassertion of governmental authority. So simply put, none of the major European states wanted to change the status quo to make either democratization easier or to make occupation or imperial expansion harder. The debates in the sort of second half of the 19th century reflect that. There were very few interstate debates about the law of war and internal conflicts in this time period, but what little I found, the influence of specific events was again negative. And in particular, the event, the Paris Commune as an insurrection became a kind of a demonstrative effect that hardened states' attitudes to push back against the idea of increasing protections for their civilian populations, and certainly introducing restrictions on how they waged colonial conflicts. And Doreen and Eyal's article speaks to this as well. This changed throughout the 20th century. It began to change in the early 20th century through accumulating atrocity in various internal conflicts. but also partially thanks to the growth of the International Red Cross movement. So there were a number of internal conflicts that stimulated new debate within the meetings of the International Red Cross movement, wars in Latin America, the Mexican Revolution, and then subsequently wars in Europe as well, and elsewhere as a result of the breakup of empires during and after the First World War. So obviously the Russian Revolution, the Hungarian Revolution as well, but especially the conflict that became sort of the essential triggering event was the Spanish Civil War. Beyond specific episodes of atrocity, I would say the one key factor was when the moment at which the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, finally came on board and decided to throw its weight behind the idea that the law of war or the Geneva Conventions should be extended to internal conflict, and this only happened for various reasons and until it happened in 1921. So fairly late in its history. Then after that, things get more complicated because what I study in the book are the moments of codification, the big conferences in which I sort of foreground the influence, the importance of coalitions of states reaching a majority that support the idea of the extension of the Geneva Conventions to internal conflict. And that was the case in 1949. And then after that, in the 1950s, things got even more complicated with wars of national liberation for self-determination, and when that became the main motivating factor for, at least for newly independent third world states, to embrace the revision of the law of armed conflict. I would say, just to close, that more generally, most states across the board and across the different time periods have never been too excited about taking on too many legal restraints in the context of internal war. The political and military incentives are commonly pretty low for them.
Thank you, Giovanni. Doreen, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think that in my work, and the work I did mostly with the Eyal Benvenisti, that was focused on nationalism, the rise of nationalism in the late 19th century, also looked at democratization processes. So I think that we looked at these processes as very much related to one another, and we traced, I guess, more than one kind of aspect in which democracy was central, and then kind of interlinked with nationalist sentiments. So democratic processes and technological developments kind of brought the experiences of war in the late 19th century much closer to the homes of people across Europe. And then at the same time, the involvement of civilians in the battlefield as well kind of made the war into a public war. So we looked at our earlier project at the Crimea War as kind of a turning point in which militaries grew bigger, inexperienced soldiers were enlisted sometimes against their will. So, and then public interest in the fate of soldiers and extensive media coverage and improved communications, all of that made wars a much greater concern, and a concern for public scrutiny more than it was before. So the kind of separation between civil society and the military was no longer sustainable. And almost in tandem with that, citizens become national citizens, and we have the introduction of male suffrage and greater participation in public affairs. So you have that kind of interrelated processes of both the public, in some ways, the public is in some ways constituted through nationalism and democratization processes, And then at the same time, civil society organizations, the notion, the idea, the possibility of civil society organizations becomes more feasible. That's when we have figures like André Dunant and Florence Nightingale that become these important entrepreneurs of the regulation of the laws of war. So we look at in the project that looks at these processes, we looked at both the emergence of civil society, so to speak, and the contribution of civil society initiatives as the developments that kind of bring many of these new codification endeavors into being. But they, of course, also pose a threat to European governments. So these democratization processes are very challenging, and governments of European governments that have the many revolutions, especially the 1848 revolutions, as very fresh memories in their consciousness, then have to also work with the new nationalist sentiment. So we have, and I guess just to kind of conclude, nationalist sentiments and the ways we consider them, and we look at the very earlier phases. So I think it's probably a good idea that I'm talking before Boyd and somewhat earlier in that sense. So in some ways so kind of Giovanni gave us the overarching theme. I'm kind of getting a bit giving you a closer look at the earlier stages, and we'll then move to Boyd. So in these earlier stages, nationalist sentiments were working in a very kind of dialectic way. So in one way, so kind of on the one hand, governments were utilizing nationalist sentiments to discipline soldiers and enlist public support. So nationalist sentiments were very good in some ways for the sake of war, so just kind of on the one hand. But then at the same time, these very sentiments also posed a very serious threat. So soldiers who were kind of too eager to fight for the sake of their nations, like the Franc-tireurs in the Franco-Prussian wars, were really a source of grave concern. So if we kind of weave together these concern and the concern over other democratization sentiments, and also other interesting sentiments that are very much related to the Paris Commune, anarchist, feminist, communist, socialist, okay, all of that kind of, so we see a very serious bubble of civil society unrest kind of infusing or informing the ways in which governments approach the concerns over the laws of war. And I guess that so there's this very nice quote that I like by Field Marshal von Moltke, where he says, generally speaking, it is no longer the ambitions of monarchs which endangers peace, but the impulses of the nation. So it's kind of the nation or the nationalist sentiment that becomes sources of very serious concern over the fate of the regulation of war. So I guess I'll take it from there. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a wonderful answer, which complete perfectly Giovanni's answer, which provide a broader answer. And then the ring, it's perfect. It's more on the 19th century. And then Boyd, I know that from your work, you're more focusing on the 20th century. So can you help us to understand more about the codification of the laws of war in the 20th century?
Yeah, sure. In my book, I also, of course, work on similar subjects. The question of nationalism doesn't disappear at the end of the 19th century. Of course, it continues very much, but in different ways throughout the 20th. And I think one of the puzzles that the drafters of the 49 conventions have to solve was, how can we accept that certain nationalist irregulars, varying from the levée en masse to partisans to guerrilla fighters, should perhaps fall under the POW convention or even the civilian convention under certain circumstances, while trying to exclude those who consider themselves anti-colonial nationalists. That's one of the puzzles these European imperial drafters face in the 40s. And so one of the chapters of the book looks at this, and also how they then frame nationalism as a force for good for the law and as a force for evil at the same time. And they have to distinguish very carefully between these different categories, while at the same time, forces from outside, whether it be in the Soviet Union or anti-colonial groups themselves, push for a very different conception of nationalism that is much more inclusive. I would not necessarily say it's completely inclusive, of course. They have their own exclusionary mechanisms, but certainly more inclusive than the proposals coming from Paris, from London, and other Western capitals in the 1940s. So again, that question of nationalism doesn't disappear, and it's the same for the period after 49 that Giovanni was already alluding to when he was making comments about the protocols and national liberation and so on and so forth. But I think Giovanni can say a little bit more about that post-49 era. So going back to the 40s, or staying within the 40s, I think there is one important shift, at least from my perspective. So I completely agree with Doreen and Eyal's analysis of the 19th century, and I think that analysis can be taken forward to the 20th century, and you can see its resonances in various debates of the laws of war taking place at different locations. I just think that in 45, 49, you can see a shift happening, where I think ideas of rights start to become more important than ever in the history of the laws of war. So most of my colleagues suggest, of course, that humanitarian law and human rights remained fundamentally distinct and developed autonomously until maybe the late 1960s, or maybe the 70s. And there are, of course, also those who say that it's only becoming important, maybe even after 9/11. So after 2001 and the invasion into Iraq by Allied forces, and where you can see human rights law being directly applied to various regimes of occupation. So in my work, I've been trying to push against this view, this kind of very rigid distinction between human rights and humanitarian law, specifically for the 1940s. I'm less interested in a very recent debate. So specifically for the 1940s, after going through all kinds of archival materials in which ideas of rights were not just present in the sense of as ideas or as concepts, but also in discourse. So I could see that leading and prominent drafters throughout the 40s were making allusions to what was going on at the UN when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted. And they explicitly said that they were drawing inspiration from it, while at the same time trying to create kind of a distinct field for the laws of war as a distinct international legal discipline. And I think that game was something that interested me enormously, and also see how these different organizations, specifically the International Committee of Red Cross, but also state drafters, try to, on the one hand, draw from human rights law certain concepts and ideas about how to protect the individual against ill treatment by the state, while at the same time carefully distinguishing human rights as a discipline from what humanitarian law should be, or what it should be about. And I think that game was really interesting, and in part was also something I've been trying to work on since basically from the start, from the conventions, because becomes my interest in the conventions. So I think that's my kind of quick response to the question of nationalism and human rights that you asked at the beginning. I've tried to kind of more carefully analyze the ways in which nationalism, rights, and ideas of humanity in wartime, or humanization of war, kind of connected, as well as state in some ways disconnected throughout that kind of very fragile geopolitical moment in the 1940s.
So if I may, just because you asked about human rights, and Boyd got to it, but I didn't, and I wanted to add a little bit to this. So human rights, I think, are a crucial, have been a crucial mobilizing force in the development of IHL. As Boyd noted, this is by now well recognized, at least for the post-1968 period. He's doing the harder work of tracing that connection back before. But what I will say about the period that I know better, so post-1968, is that human rights became an extremely, again, a politically mobilizing force within the UN in particular, at the hands of newly decolonized states. So there was a debate about whether they were doing human rights talk merely to sustain self-determination, or different views on this. I don't really take a view on that debate. What I highlight from what I've seen in the diplomatic debates, in the archives, is the extremely productive effect that came from that UNGA, the General Assembly, centered politicization of human rights by the third world. Human rights discourse and to some extent the new instruments of law became a glue, one among a few other types of glues that around which a rather disparate newly decolonized world of states, third world actors, coalesced to oppose the views of stalwart Western countries in Europe and the US as well. And this comes through time and time again when you read the documents of, as I have, of the US, the UK, and France, those documents demonstrate that they perceive the human rights constituency within the UNGA as extremely active, as extremely effective, and as extremely dangerous. And they were effective in that cohort of states was effective for pushing for helping alongside other actors to push for the revision, the transformation of the law of war in the 1970s through the negotiation of the additional protocols, and that amounted to some particular specific changes to IHL, such as greater protection for civilians, codified protection for civilians against the dangers of warfare, the inclusion or the incorporation of basic guarantees for all victims of armed conflict, which are very much human rights inspired. And then we could have a more detailed chat about what parts of the protocols may or may not reflect human rights inspired ideas, whether pushed by the third world or not. But that's kind of a general thrust. I do believe that the human rights played a hugely important role in the development of the law of war in the 1970s.
Thank you, Giovanni. I think these three very insightful answers are really a very good transition for the next question I would like to raise, that might be related to what we could call the non-Western perspectives on IHL, or let's say, to put it in an issue that Boyd flagged, I think 1 year ago, if I recall correctly, the decolonization of IHL. And I remember this was roughly a year ago because I was participating in the Black Lives Matter rallies here in Geneva, and I sent Boyd a picture of Henri Dunant with the Black Lives Matter mask. But I think this is an important point because all of your different contributions, in a way, challenge the Iranic, let's say, humanizing arc of IHL in different ways. And I also wanted to ask you, how do you see in these new historiographical perspectives, let's say, the role that non-traditional Western actors, players, institutions did for IHL that perhaps we're only exploring until now? On the top of my mind, it seems that the contribution of Marxist, or let's say state socialist perspectives, is fundamental to rethink and revisit this story. And we have contributions from Francine Hirsch's book to the recent Journal of the History of International Law special issue, in which Giovanni was present. Anyhow, I have spoken too much, but could you perhaps talk more to this new non-Western perspectives and how do they model, complicate, or nuance the Western picture of the laws of war?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question, and I think it's a question that is probably interesting for all of us, not just for me. So in the work that that is coming out this year, so my book is less interested in the question of how did third world states, or at least states from outside of Europe and North America, try to engage with the conventions in the 1940s. That acting process was highly Eurocentric for a number of reasons, which I explore in the book. So in the book, I try to understand and explain why that drafting festival, as you want to call it, in Geneva in 49, as well as preceding years, was so heavily dominated by Western state as well as the Soviet Union at the very last stage. And that's actually a quite interesting process. And in my new work, I want to kind of shift perspective and get a sense of what was happening in the Third World, specifically between the early 1950s and 1977, the edition of protocols were adopted, and how did Third World actors engage with the laws of war? When it comes to my own book, I try to not so much include or engage with the views of states from outside of Europe, and mainly because their role in shaping the convention. So, I mean, specifically the provisions, the way the treaties were structured was relatively small compared to the very dominant role played by states like the United States, France, and so on and so forth. So what I try to do in the book is something slightly different, and it is to look at kind of how that very strong narrative of kind of the origin story of humanitarian law, dating back to either Henry Dunant in the 1860s, or even stronger narrative, I think, of the Geneva Conventions of 49, is that they have their origins in the experience of the Second World War. So we usually are presented with a story in which the drafters of the conventions were primarily motivated by the shock of atrocity and inspired by humanitarian principles. And the treaties they created were, so to say, a product of liberal humanitarianism dating back to Henry Dunant's advocacy efforts since 1860. That's kind of the line one can draw in a kind of mainstream narrative of the convention's making. So my book tells a different story. So it shows how the conventions of 49, far from being kind of an abashedly liberal blueprint, was the outcome of a series of political struggles. Among the drafters, many were not liberal, as you were already alluding to, Daniel, in your remarks, and whose ideas changed radically over time. If you look at the debates in, let's say, 45, 46, 47, you see completely different discussion than the one taking place in 49. And I think that's interesting for many different reasons. Nor were these conventions merely a product of idealism or even the shock of Hitler's atrocities. So constructing the conventions for me, or at least for the drafters, I should say, meant outlawing some forms of inhumanity while tolerating others. And it concerned a great deal more than simply recognizing these shortcomings of international law as experienced or as revealed by the Second World War. In making the conventions, drafters sought to contest European imperial rule, empower the ICRC, ensure rights during wartime, and eventually also prepare for wars to come. And that's also the reason why my book is called Preparing for War. So what I try to show in the book, and that's kind of the main argument, is that these individuals, mainly men, if you look at the images of the convention's drafting halls, you see predominantly men, some in military costumes, some in civilian clothes. Predominantly men, they were really not so much passive characters responding to past events, as many people assume, but really active protagonists trying to shape the future of warfare. At least that's the impression that I've gained from the archival documents that I've been collecting over the years and studying them. So in many different ways to try to define the contours of future battlefields and define whose lives mattered, when the law should apply, who deserved protection, who did not deserve protection, and we had the right to enforce all these principles in future armed conflict. That is, for me, what the laws of war was much more about than this kind of a retrospective narrative of people coming together after the shock of the Second World War and trying to fill the gaps in the law and move forward, so to say, while then being constantly confronted with the kind of incompleteness of their work because they could not have imagined how the future would look like. And that narrative, I think, is quite problematic. And that's what I try to show in the book, and also how these different drafters then thought about the future of warfare, shaped by the Cold War, decolonization, and ideas of rights.
Thank you, Boyd. Before I give the word to two other speakers, I just wanted to remind you that Giovanni will have to leave us quite shortly. So if any of you in the audience have questions, I would encourage you to think about them very harshly right now. Doreen, Giovanni, would you like to continue?
Giovanni, maybe because he has to leave earlier. So please, Giovanni.
I'm a bit on the stage. Am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Okay. Right. So the question about non-Western perspectives, including socialist perspectives and their influence on the development of IHL. I guess I've begun already to answer the question by reference to the importance of human rights discourse and mobilization by newly decolonized states in the 1960s and 70s. Well, one thing that I think we should admit is that the contribution of from a non-Western perspective can mean a great many things, and I don't think we've, not us here, but in general, we often are not precise about what it is that we mean by a non-Western perspective. I guess what we're talking about here is what non-Western states proposed, and what kind of battles they fought. So speaking about states here, in terms of remaking IHL in the 1970s, as I began to say, I think important contributions include the estigmatization, or the further estigmatization of colonialism and colonial war, and the concurrent legitimation of wars of national liberation and against racist regimes and occupation. The enhancement of the protection of civilian populations against the dangers of warfare, but also a cohort of non-aligned states led the cause to increase the regulation, really initially to ban the use of certain conventional weapons in war during the 1970s as well. If we were to include national liberation movements, the list would grow. And if, for anyone who's interested in learning more about that, I would recommend you read the work of Helen Kinsella, Amanda Alexander, Emma McKinnon, Jessica White, and Eleanor Davey, who've written about this in various ways. I think it's important, though, to remember that when because we're talking about states here, and states, whether they are Western or non-Western, they are self-interested actors that are interested in preserving their sovereignty. So the influence of non-Western states should also, I think, be read from the opposite end, not just in terms of the positive contributions that they may have made, but also in terms of the negative contributions that they may have made to the development of IHL. In particular, here I would raise the case of their stringent rejection of more robust regulation for non-international armed conflicts and civil wars in the 1970s. At that time, they had a legitimate argument of being concerned about neocolonialism and about sort of by endorsing greater regulation of non-international armed conflict to thereby also authorize neocolonial interventions within their territory, which again, it was a legitimate argument. But on the other hand, they had another motive, they had another agenda, which was that they were clearly interested in waging anti-secessionist wars and sort of resolving their internal turmoils with as much of a free hand as they possibly could without much regard for the civilian population, as may have been the case. So it's important to consider both sides of the question. About socialist states in particular, I think I would echo a little bit what I've said. Well beyond sort of what specific ideas they may have brought on the table that kind of reflect a socialist tradition, I will emphasize the importance of their presence and of their politicized diplomacy, the finger pointing that they engaged with during the diplomatic conferences against Western states, including, but I guess most prominently, the Brits and the French, but also the US, that deployed despite the traditional narratives about IHL being a liberal regime and human rights being a liberal regime. Well, as it turns out, Western states were quite conservative and didn't really want to see many progressive revisions to IHL. And it was only thanks to the politicization, whether sincere or not, coming from the socialist bloc of states led by the Soviet Union, but also then subsequently by the newly decolonized states. It was only through that politicization that we saw many of these outcomes that we value as important survive negotiations. And that is the case of Common Article 3 in 1949, which as we know is the first binding rule of IHL to apply to non-international armed conflict, but other areas of the law as well. They didn't always succeed. Boyd has written on this as well. The socialist bloc led the charge to try to get aerial bombardment banned in 1949, and they failed. They failed partly because the West mobilized to sabotage the initiative. And on the other hand, the Soviet Union, as I was emphasizing about newly decolonized states, the Soviet Union also self-interested state that could behave like a great power to defend its military interest when convenient. And so even though they politicized some issues and they pointed fingers at the West to to score political points and perhaps also legal provisions that would tie the hands of Western states, they also were able to collaborate behind the scenes and to cooperate with the US and with the UK to prevent issues or changes to the law that they both perceived to be inconvenient. And so, again, a very interesting politicized dynamic. And it was through that sort of that different kinds of politicking, taking sides and coalescing with different types of actors, that we saw some revisions, some proposals emerge successful from negotiations, and that we saw others flounder or sink.
Thank you, Giovanni. Doreen?
Yes, thank you very much. This is also interesting. So I guess in the history of international law, as most of you probably know, the distinction between the civilized and the uncivilized is a very central theme for in this historiography, and that distinction is usually applied, or the main connotation for that distinction is imperialism and imperial rule outside of Europe. So I guess the first, actually, my first answer to the question would be to suggest that in the project that I wrote with the Alba and Venisti, we actually saw the same kind of distinction, or we're trying to illuminate how that same distinction could also be applied within Europe, within the European context. And that kind of alludes also to the questions asked on the socialist context or issues of class, because actually when we look at the European versus non-European divide, we often forget that divide is focused on elites within Europe vis-a-vis others outside of Europe. And within the European context, there was also a huge tension, and there are still enormous tensions and disparities between elites or governmental elites, professional elites, and others, and those who were called to fight the wars and bear the costs of war throughout in the late era period of the 19th century. So I guess the first kind of challenge or argument that we actually make, or perhaps a contribution or attempt to kind of destabilize a little bit the debate over, or the ways in which we frame the discussion over the civilized and uncivilized, is to highlight the ways in which also the people in Europe were conceived and perceived as uncivilized, as unruly subjects by governing elites in Europe, and kind of conceiving the laws of war as an attempt to regulate those savages of Europe. So it's kind of destabilizing the familiar distinction in a kind of different way. We also address the I guess the North-South divide, which I think is enormously important in the ways we analyze the history of international law more broadly, and of course the histories of international law, humanitarian law more specifically. But here we also, I think, look at the divisions within Europe, between European governments, the kind of North-South or smaller, bigger states. So I think you can actually see, methodologically speaking, the ways in which these distinctions that are kind of very, I guess, essentialized when you look at them as only relevant for the North-South in the kind of geographical sense, can actually be quite illuminating when addressed or applied or conceived in the context of Europe itself. So that, I guess, another move that we try to make in that article is to try to challenge that divide as something that is only relevant for the North-South in the kind of conventional way. Beyond that project, given the kind of colonial context, I was very much inspired by the new international economic order work, and also the historiography of that network of states and agents. And I thought it was, and I think as a reader, I found it very illuminating, and also I worked a little bit on its relevance for the corporate regulation context. So, I think in some ways inspired by that. And my colleagues here have looked at some of these actors in the context of IHL itself, but I actually was inspired by that later historiography, and I'm now looking at earlier kind of grassroots movements and networks within Europe in the 19th century, and that kind of connects to your question about socialist sentiments and kind of other sentiments that are not only relevant for 20th century IHL, but were actually quite relevant for 19th century developments, both in the context of the Paris Commune as a kind of a social experiment and the ways in which it kind of posed a huge threat for governments, but also more broadly, ideas about suffrage, equality, etc., were very much in vogue throughout the 19th century, and were infused in the work of the peace movement and other networks that were kind of pushing for the regulation of the wars of war. So I guess my point more broadly, kind of my meta argument would be that these kind of categories are, of course, are very historically contingent, but then also could be sometimes quite inspiring in looking beyond the specific context in which they emerge, or we conceive of them as such, and then could be applied when we do historical work to different contexts and be quite refreshing. So I guess I wouldn't have done the work on grassroots of international humanitarian law in the 19th century have I not read on the new international economic order historiography of the 20th century.
So Giovanni will unfortunately leave us, and if anyone has a question, he can email him. So I will add in the chat just his email address so that everyone can reach him if you have any precise questions. Yeah, so thank you, Giovanni, for joining us, and it was a real pleasure, and it was also great to hear more about your work and your expertise, and thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for the invitation, and Danielle as well. Look forward to continuing the conversation, and same thanks to you, Doreen and Boyd. Continue. I look forward to catching up through the podcast later on. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Giovanni. So we will continue the conversation with a more precise case study about the laws of war and about the revolution which has represented World War II, and how World War II has really impacted not only the realms of governance, international law, but also humanitarian international law. So last year in the in the seminar in global history and international law, we had social historian Guillaume Morales, which has highlighted how racism has really underpinned the American participation at the Nuremberg trial, and especially through the lens of the Jim Crow laws and the definition of the crimes against humanity. So recently also Francine Hirsch has produced really a new vision with the Soviet participation, as has already been mentioned in the seminar. She has really brought a new perspective, which is highly interesting. But also when we are reading Doreen's work and Boyd's work, they're also talking about the Nuremberg trial and their legacies. So and I found in Doreen's work, there is in her book, there is a chapter on the industrialist trials at Nuremberg, which is very interesting. And she highlighted also the importance of the Hobbesian model of statehood and vision of violence. And I found it very, very interesting to read this chapter, because before I didn't really I think about that. So I found it very, very interesting, this chapter, and very new and new vision on the Nuremberg trial. And then after, I was wondering when I was reading this wonderful book, how maybe Boyd could answer these following questions. And then it's so I would be very interesting to know, so how you could explain how did the Hobbesian model of statehood and vision of violence limit the legacy of the Nuremberg trial, and shortly after the Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. So Giovanni mentioned this Article 3 already before, and maybe if you could also just speak a little bit, because I know that you can answer these questions from your work and also from Doreen's book and also Boyd van Dijk work. So how did this model, Hobbesian model, impact the development of international law in the following decades? Yeah, maybe we can start with Doreen, because Doreen, your work focused more on the Nuremberg trials. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne-Sophie. That's a very kind of sophisticated and complicated question, but I'll do my best to address all of the facets of the questions that you raised. So the book, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on the regulation of corporations in international law. So my answer won't be. I would try to be more modest in the scope of the answer. So I can't really speak for the entire Nuremberg legacy or its influence or its content even in other contexts, but merely address the kind of ideas that were developed in the context of corporations and corporate regulations. So in that particular context, there's a huge puzzle in the industrialist trials. The puzzle is that in the time when the industrialist trials were actually executed and the prosecution was writing up the indictment, the idea of having a corporation and a legal personality indicted as a responsible entity for international for legal for violations of criminal law was something that was already quite present in the American jurisprudence. So the puzzle was why the Americans didn't incorporate the ideas that they were already quite accustomed to into the Nuremberg legacy, and trying to navigate my ways into the quest of what's not there. Why did they not do something? Is the reason why I eventually realized that part of the reason, at least, was that they were very heavily informed by a very specific understanding of the Nazi regime and the relationship between the state apparatus and the business and the businesses that were operating, or the industrialists more concretely. And it's there that you see a tension between a much more, I guess, a more sophisticated path-breaking understanding of that relationship that was introduced to the prosecution by Franz Neumann and others, that actually were able to grasp the complexities of that relationship, and the tendency of the judges at the tribunals to fall back time and again into the presumption that a state is always a Hobbesian state, namely there is a very clear regime that dominates, controls, and regulates the whereabouts of business actors. So that was kind of a fallback position that was kind of consistent in these decisions. And that insistence on the Hobbesian model was also an insistence on a hierarchical governing authority of the state over the operations of businesses. That kind of presumption failed to capture the ways in which business-state relationships were actually operationalized in Nazi Germany, and more fundamentally hindered the possibility of developing a theory of responsibility for economic actors, regardless of their relationship with the state. So the industrialist trials required in their judgments an involvement of state agents and state apparatuses as a condition for illegality in international law. So in order for something, for a business practice to be considered a violation of the laws of war, for instance, and a state agency or presence and some sense of an attribution link to the state apparatus had to be established. And that, of course, as we know, in the ways in which the Nazi totalitarian state was widely documented and analyzed by historians and philosophers as others, was actually very much characterized by the loss of such a functioning legal system or a sense of domination of a clear state apparatus over different actors. So the totalitarity of the state was somewhat, I guess, operationalized through the loss of a clear sense of hierarchy and control. And the chapters of the book that address this issue expose the tension between the tribunal's ill-suited theory of the Nazi state as a well-functioning governance regime that they imagined it to be, and the reality of the total collapse and eventual loss of the rule of law. So they kind of completely missed out the kind of deep essence of the lack of rule of law that was the raison d'etre of the Nazi regime, and the ways in and kind of facilitated the violations of the laws of war and other criminal law violations by business actors and others. And so the chapter kind of shows how this very collapse benefited business actors twice in some ways. Once because they actually took advantage of these realities, and second, when the tribunals failed to recognize and develop a theory of international responsibility for those taking advantage of those conditions. And I guess the tragic aspects of these decisions is that their influence lingers to this very day, when we still have this requirement of some sense of link between business activities and the state, and more, I guess, more profoundly, we don't have the legal entity as a subject of criminal responsibility in international law. So that's kind of a lengthy answer to your question, but I hope it kind of it clarifies how a theory, right? We all speak about theories in our classrooms and in our books, the Hobbesian theory of the Leviathan and the Behemoth theory of Neumann's. These theories kind of come into life in these cases. You see how they are infused and inform and shape the indictment, and you see how the fallback to the Hobbesian theory is such a central, almost unconscious understanding of what the state is, informs and shapes the tribunal's decisions.
Thanks, wonderful answer. So Boyd, please.
Yeah, this is a really complicated set of questions. And now I'm kind of in a difficult position of having to go second after Doreen's really interesting comments. So I think I just want to say two things. One is about the question of how can we curtail sovereignty in wartime, and specifically colonial sovereignty in wartime through humanitarian law in the 1940s. And then second, I want to say a couple of things about the connection between Nuremberg and Geneva in that same kind of epoch. So starting with the first issue, what puzzled me after going through our archival materials, reading the literature, is that it's very hard to explain why imperial powers accepted a binding international law under sovereignty for wars taking place within their empires. And of course, I'm referring to Common Article 3 that Giovanni was already speaking about before he had to leave. And we share that puzzle, and I think our answers are complementary, but we take a slightly different approach to how to answer that question. So in my work, I've tried to actually go beyond Europe and see how imperial powers try to deal with the fact that the ICRC, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, tried to intervene in various colonial wars after 45. We don't see that before the Second World War. There is this one case, that's the Rif War in North Africa, where the ICRC is trying to get itself involved in a colonial war, in this case involving different European imperial powers. But that's the only case, as far as we know, where the ICRC got involved in colonial wars. And that's radically different from the post-45 period, when they suddenly get engaged in Palestine, they get involved in Indonesia, Indochina, and various other places. So for me, that was quite puzzling. And I was curious how these imperial powers then set up different legal arguments to justify that intervention. So the ICRC, or more generally an international organization intervention in these conflicts, and how they at the same time try to keep the door closed for others. And of course, why they let the ICRC to come in. And what surprised me even more was that these declining imperial powers, whether being Britain, France, or the Netherlands in this case, that they actually asked the ICRC to come in and help and assist with providing humanitarian aid to different categories of victims of war in these colonial conflicts. So while trying to reconstruct the making of Common Article 3 in one of the chapters of my book, I showed in how these ideas of sovereignty started to change quite substantially after 45, and in ways that proved quite also transformative for the future of humanitarian law, lasting up to today. I mean, Common Article 3 is probably one of the most important provisions of the conventions as they're interpreted every day by states or by non-state actors. Think also of the so-called war on terror, in which Common Article 3 has played a very central role. So it's important to keep it also in mind when I'm talking specifically about the 1940s. So what stunned me was the ways in which these imperial powers first had to kind of accept that colonial sovereignty had changed quite substantially after the Second World War, while at the same time trying to keep the door closed for further legal precedents that would keep that door open permanently, and also allow ICRC and UN observers to come in the future, so after 49, when the conventions were eventually adopted, and then monitor prisons and all of these other places where detainees were held, and often, of course, also held in very inhumane conditions. So that game of, trying to, or accepting that colonial sovereignty has changed, while keeping the door in some way closed for further interventions by international organization, was something I found really interesting, really striking. And I think in some ways, it also connects to Doreen and Giovanni's comments about how sovereignty changed, ideas of sovereignty at least changed on the international level quite substantially at that time. At the same time, we should be careful not to present this being Common Article 3 or related provisions as a breakthrough, as something that completely changed the nature of international law in armed conflict. As we know, the track record of Common Article 3 after 49 is certainly not impressive, in some ways quite unimpressive. And that comes for different reasons. But that normative shift in itself, I think, is significant and needs to be explained historically. And we cannot only go to Geneva and other places where in Europe where the conventions were made. We also have to go beyond Europe and see what sort of legal arguments were presented by imperial powers themselves. And of course, also anti-colonial actors will also start to engage with the conventions in ways that were proved quite transformative, and also links then with the debates and the issues that Giovanni was raising about the 60s and 70s, and how third world states suddenly embraced, or maybe not so suddenly, embraced ideas of humanitarian law in order to push their different political agendas. So that's a very long answer to the first issue. Hopefully, I'll be more brief when it comes to the Nuremberg Geneva Conventions. The first thing I should mention is that Nuremberg and other international criminal tribunals, of course, set certain higher standards for the conduct of warfare. They explicitly outlawed and criminalized certain acts, and drafters of the great powers had to at least, well, not necessarily accept, but certainly face and engage with these precedents that were created by these different tribunals, and more generally with public expectations with regard to the regulation and humanization of warfare, which Giovanni talks a lot about in his own book. So those are the two things that are, I think, quite important. So Nuremberg as a place where new standards for warfare were put into place. and more generally Nuremberg, Tokyo, and all the other criminal tribunals, creating also expectations about how warfare will be waged in the future and what sort of limitations that future should have in terms of law. And I think that those expectations and those legal precedents were particularly relevant debates about partisan warfare, civilian protection, even air bombing, and also colonial wars, that it became increasingly difficult, at least at a normative level, to claim that civil and colonial wars could not fall into international law. And I think that's all in some way connected, even though in the book I try to carefully also reconstruct the entire process. The last thing I should mention about Nuremberg and the conventions is the issue of the grave breaches provisions of the conventions and how they are made and in what ways they're connected. So for those who have never heard about the grave breaches, they're essentially the criminal law provisions of the conventions of 49. And they set out a structure of criminal prosecution in case the conventions are violated by the different parties to an armed conflict. And what is interesting, at least from my perspective, was that there was a lot of debate about whether or not the convention should have such a framework. And if it would have such a framework, or should have such a framework, then what sort of framework should it be? And that debate was initially, so let's say the period from 45 up to 47, precisely when these trials were taking place, there were quite some resistance, not just from states, but also from the ICRC to the idea of including criminal law provisions into what became known as humanitarian law. For many, that project of criminal law was anti-humanitarian. It was about condemning people rather than trying to protect them and provide humanitarian aid and access, all those kind of things. So many within the ICRC saw it as a anti-humanitarian project initially. In fact, some even thought that Nuremberg and Tokyo were perfect cases of victor's justice. And they felt that that's not something we want to replicate through humanitarian law by including criminal law provisions. That position that was shared not by all the ICRC legal experts, but certainly by some, can be explained by different factors. And it's not just about certain legal ideas they had or about what they felt the future of humanitarian laws should look like. It's of course also the ways in which they were connected also with the Nazi legal regime itself. Some of the ICRC legal experts had quite sympathetic views for the regime, certainly during the Second World War, and they felt that the way these Nazi officials were treated by allies was unfair, and humanitarian law should, in fact, perhaps even provide them with some protection under humanitarian law. So here you see them struggling. On the one hand, they don't want to have criminal law provisions in the conventions. On the other hand, they're advocating a policy that would include certain liberal safeguards in the conventions, like due process and so on and so forth. And that struggle happened continuously throughout the post-45 period, in which ICRC legal experts eventually came around the idea of we should have these great breaches provisions. But they didn't make that system by themselves. In fact, they asked criminal law experts to come to Geneva in December 48 to provide them with ideas and concepts to create these drafts. And these criminal law experts were not the smallest ones, so to say, not the smallest names, including Hersch Lauterpacht himself came to Geneva to help them out with this issue. So it's very interesting how this position towards Nuremberg as a moment of international law changed among these drafters. And again, not just states or state drafters, but also the ICRC itself and what sort of divisions it created within its own ranks.
Oh, that's a great answers. So thanks, Doreen and Boyd. So we will open soon the Q&A. So if you have any question, just please raise your hand already, or because I see that among the participants, many of you have expertise in this field, so don't hesitate to ask questions. Otherwise, I will just continue on the questions of the importance of Nuremberg. And because nowadays we see that when we look at the new publications, we will, so in the coming year, there are about 1 or 2 books or even articles on counterinsurgency. And one of them, for example, is from Terence Peterson from the University of Florida, and he's going to publish the book on counterinsurgency in Algeria. But when we study counterinsurgency, and we are always coming back to World War II and in Asia, but also in Germany. So with the Nazi counterinsurgency policies, and when we look at this Nuremberg moment, so there are discussions in the trials, before the trials, in the committees on Nazi counterinsurgency policies. And what is interesting is that it reflects in the following decades in the colonial wars, but also in the Cold War and in the Third World struggle to delegitimize national liberation. So my last question would be to Doreen and to Boyd. How were these discussions on Nazi counterinsurgency policies at Nuremberg reflected in Geneva or in the Cold War or in the Third World struggle to legitimize national liberation? So Doreen, if you want to start.
I think it's more Boyd's field. I suppose it's less my my field of research. But so Boyd, please, I'm very curious to hear your answer.
I'm also happy just to wait and collect some questions, including this one from Anne-Sophie, and then we can have a discussion with the two of us or maybe the four of us, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course, that's completely okay. So I don't see any hands or in the chat. So who would like to participate or to raise a question? Or just open your, you can just open your video and just ask question. So not many. So yeah, Boyd, just please, you can continue to answer the question. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I also don't want to repeat myself and come back to the points that I've been making before you asked your question. So for me, that Nuremberg moment was, and the kind of ideas of counterinsurgency that were propelled was quite revealing. So for many of these drafters in Geneva and other places in the years before 1949, where the conventions were being discussed, the question of how can we accept that certain Nazi-style counterinsurgency policies, such as the taking and killing of hostages, should be outlawed, while at the same time trying to keep a certain door open for other inhumane measures that were perhaps necessary to keep the security state intact in case they would fight new wars in the future. I think that's kind of the constant struggle that different states, whether we in socialist or liberal or other types of states are involved in the conventions making, had to face. So in the book, I also show how these conceptions of what is inhumane in warfare changed really radically throughout the 20th century. So if you look at the 1920s and 1930s, for instance, when it comes to air bombing, there are different theories and even lawyers defending air bombing as potentially humane. Whereas in the post-45 period, that seems to shift quite radically against it, while at the same time, the conventions do not have a specific rule that says we should not target civilians from the air, or we should carefully distinguish civilians and combatants in air war. And not such a rule exists. Of course, we have safety zones in the civilian convention. We have other kind of principles that sought to defend and protect certain categories of protected persons from air warfare, but there's not a specific rule of distinction in the conventions. And so I show also in the book how these ideas evolved, even though there was perhaps some normative pressure to accept the principle of distinction in air warfare in the conventions. But but again, it's quite striking how these ideas of humanity evolve over time. And I think our task as scholars, whether being political scientists or lawyer or a historian like me, is to grapple with how do we explain these shifts and what factors, what structural factors, as well as agency factors have pushed the law's direction in that way and throughout time. And let me stop here, and maybe some more questions will emerge.
Yes, I think we have one question. So, Zoila Vazani, if you want to unmute yourself and yeah, please ask your question.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for the great presentations, the great discussion. So I have a question regarding a remark made by Voigt van Dijk that namely once states codified, they mainly try to prepare for future wars. So also providing an alternative to know that famous quotation that laws of war are always, one war behind. So a different view on this. And most HL lawyers today seem to opine that if we were to codify laws of war today, we would have worse results than the ones already existing, the 1949 Convention, the additional protocols there too. So I was wondering, since we do not have any codification efforts today, how do you think that states prepare now for future wars? Through interpretative efforts, through soft law, because that's very widespread? Yeah, I would be very interested in hearing your views, and thanks again for the great discussion.
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's one that is, I think, quite important. I've always been puzzled by those who claim that the laws of war are intrinsically or inherently retrospective, that it's always one war behind, as you rightly mentioned. If you look at the discussions taking place within delegations or within states that participated in the convention's making, you see that they discuss different scenarios of how the future might unravel itself and what sort of legal answers they should provide in return. So they discuss different scenarios, just like states do now. What sort of wars are we going to fight in the future, and how should we, as state or even as a non-state actor, let's say a rebel group, then embrace a certain interpretation of the law. That seems to be not just straightforward, but even common knowledge. But when it comes to the interpretation of how these rules are then made and the history of the laws of war, that whole observation seems to go to the background, and we try to then explain, well, how come that the laws of war have certain gaps or have certain shortcomings? It's not necessarily because these individuals, so the drafters of these treaties, customs, whatever you're interested in, whatever you're looking at, were ignorant about what's going on in their own time and what might come in the future. I think the gaps and the problems and the shortcomings of international law is exactly because they knew what they were facing and what they were dealing with. So I'll give you one example where it hopefully becomes a little bit more clear. So Common Article 3 is, as I've mentioned, often seen as kind of the most innovative provision of the conventions, but it's often also criticized for being too basic, not doing enough, and being incomplete or even powerless in the face of sovereignty. And I think all those critiques are probably right. But then you also have to keep in mind who made Common Article 3 in the first place. And many people then assume, well, it's probably going to be some humanitarians in Geneva coming together and then presenting a draft eventually became Common Article 3. But in reality, the text of Common Article 3 it was made by the French imperial delegation. They deliberately left the question of when it applies and who holds the power of when it should apply in state hands. So the sovereign discretion was deliberately held or kept out of the hands of international organizations or other kind of actors beyond the state. So this can explain why certain imperial states, whether it be in France itself, in Algeria in the 1950s or in later days, could claim, well, this is not an armed conflict. We're dealing with a riot, or we're dealing with an emergency in which we don't apply Common Article 3. Whereas if the drafters, in this case, French drafters in particular, had made very clear in Common Article 3 texts that what non-international armed conflict would look like, that would have made their legal arguments and legal claims in the 50s, 60s, and 70s much more difficult. At least normatively, to make. So I think if we see these drafters as ignorant of the present as well as the future, we make, I think, a quite significant mistake, because we also don't take them seriously necessarily as historical actors, about what sort of ideas they had and what form of agency they displayed in drafting these conventions. And I think it also comes back to the question you asked about the present. I think states, whether being the hegemon itself, the United States, or smaller states like the state that I come from, that is Netherlands, they also think about what sort of conflicts, what sort of wars are we going to fight in the future, and what sort of legal restraints do we then accept when, for instance, thinking about air bombing, or think about cyber warfare, or about even artificial intelligence. What sort of methods and weapons do we want to use in the future, and which weapons do we think are intrinsic or inherent to the wars that we're going to fight, whether as a NATO alliance or as an individual state?
Thank you, Boyd. Doreen, do you have any parting remarks on the future of the laws of war or the historiography of the laws of war?
Yeah, I suppose I do. I think that broadly speaking, in terms of methodology and how to think about the histories of the laws of war, or the history maybe of international law more broadly, I think that at least my inclination is to move beyond the focus that we had until recently on more kind of intellectual history that's focused on professional international lawyers' writings and practices, which are enormously important and highly influential and deserve all of our attention as historians. And yet I think that the time may be ripe to move into more, I guess, to other actors in some ways, which are counter-hegemonic actors of various strands, to look at social histories more broadly, cultural histories, and perhaps to look at roads not taken. So in many ways, when we focus our attention both in diplomatic history and in intellectual history on the works and writings, practices, drafts, and ideas of those who mattered, in the sense of those who drafted, or those whose ideas we still read in our texts, we tend to neglect those who try to make a difference but were to some extent forgotten, so, or in some way sidelined or silenced or disregarded or marginalized. And their ideas may be quite important in various ways. They may be a source of inspiration, but they may also be the reason for some of the ideas that were eventually put into place. So in the case of the earlier laws of war that I've worked on with the Benveniste, so in some ways, the laws of war that were eventually codified could be conceived as a reaction to ideas, sentiments, and practices of grassroots and of various kinds. So what were these ideas and why were they negated so heavily? I think are also the questions that we are already ready in some ways to unravel and think of anew. And in some ways, as legal historians or as lawyers, this is also a counter-hegemonic move. So I think in some ways inspired by the work of Ingo Vanske and Kevin John Heller in the Contingencies book that they have, the counterfactual kind of question, I think invites us to consider those actors, those ideas, and those segments of history that were somewhat neglected by the fact that as lawyers, we tend to focus on what's there and what's recognized as law and not what was actually decided to be outside the scope of the legal corpus. So I guess my invitation would be to try and kind of move beyond that focus and look at other both agents and sources.
Thank you, Doreen. I agree completely, and I'm very excited to see the new directions that the history of international law, and let's see more broadly the histories of global governance and world ordering, will take in the coming years and decades. I would just like to conclude by thanking all of you for your attention, in particular to our three wonderful speakers for the very insightful responses. I think you leave us plenty of food for thought and questions to continue raveling later. I just wanted to remind you that next week we'll be having our next session on anti-colonial imaginations at the international. In many ways, it resonates, of course, with some of the topics we have discussed today. And we will be joined by Sarah Dunstan, who I see is here with us in the audience, Ngozi Ezgrau, and Basuki Nesaya. We will send out shortly also a call for papers for junior scholars for an event we want to do on June 17th, if I'm not wrong, Sophie, please correct me. Thank you again for your time and attention. Please keep in tune for the podcast that we will share shortly, and we remain at your disposal with me and Sophie for any further questions, comments, or concerns.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thanks Boyd and Doreen. And if you didn't have the chance to look at their work, just read Boyd articles and his forthcoming book. And I'm really looking forward to read this monograph and also Doreen's book, because it's a wonderful work. So, and thank you so much, Boyd and Doreen. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.